This is a panel on the politics of the city. We have three great speakers, all of whom are dealing in some way with cities as sites of conflict and of potential cooperation, but who are also implicitly or explicitly putting into question, troubling, or unsettling the presumed link, presumed that is by the Western model, between urbanization and liberalization. So much in the same way that we might use Asian cities to problematize the very category of city itself and what counts as a city, the boundaries between the urban and the non-urban. After all, these are categories that were developed in a particular social formation at a particular time in more or less 19th century England, amidst the romantic valorization of the rural over the urban. So just as we might question those categories by reference to Asian cities, so too might we question, or at least trouble a little bit, the presumed link also based on the Western experience between urbanization and liberalization. So I very much look forward to these papers today. We have three speakers: Gavin Shatkin, Associate Professor in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern; Abidin Kusno, who's the Director of the Center for Southeast Asia Research at the University of British Columbia; and Mona Serageldin, who is the Vice President of the Institute for International Urban Development. We will go in the order as listed on the program, so we will please start with Gavin Shatkin, who will speak on the politics of land in contemporary Asian cities.
Hi, everybody. Thanks to everyone for having invited me to this event. This has been a fascinating conversation already, and I'm looking forward to the continuing conversation. It seems like everybody who's come up has thanked different people, which indicates that there was a lot of people behind the scenes who made all of this possible. I'd like to thank Enrique and Cynthia as people who have really helpful to me in inviting me and in making this happen. So in my comments today, I'll focus on the role of land in shaping urban politics in contemporary Asian cities. The idea that land plays a central role in shaping urban politics is, of course, not new. Harvey Molotch wrote 38 years ago of the idea of the city as a growth machine, that urban politics was really driven by the interest of real estate developers and corporations, and particularly their interest in land. Now, Asian cities of today are, of course, very different from the American cities of the 1970s and 70s that Molotch was writing about, and indeed they're very different from each other. And one of the questions that's come up in the first session was, is there something distinct that we can say, that is unique to Asian cities? And my answer to that question is quite simply no. That Asian cities are, not necessarily unique. That we might also think about Buenos Aires or Lagos. We talk about issues of density and the use of public space. These are things that are not necessarily unique to Asian cities. I think these are things that we can find parallels with in many other parts of the world. And Asian cities, of course, are very different from each other. But I'm interested in land in part because, to me, questions of land really do represent a narrative of similarity in the politics of cities in ways that I'll talk about over the course of my comments today. So over the past 3 decades, the massive processes of urbanization in Asia, along with restless and often speculative flows of global finance, have combined to subject cities to uneven but relentless upward pressures on land values in cities and at the urban fringe. The potential profits to be had from the exploitation of the difference between existing land values and potential land values to be had from urban redevelopment, or what the geographer Neil Smith has talked about as the rent gap, has therefore presented governments with distinct opportunities to capitalize politically on redevelopment. Governments throughout Asia have maneuvered to capitalize on these opportunities, for example, by selling or leasing government land, using government powers to take land through compulsory acquisition, and through land reclamation. These tools have been used to enable corporate takeovers of large tracts of urban land for the development of new towns, export processing zones, shopping malls, and other kinds of development intended to maximize economic growth and revenue to governments and their corporate partners. These efforts have amounted, I would argue, to what I refer to as a real estate turn in urban politics and policy, a focus of substantial political energy on the monetization of land as an important strategy for the empowerment of the state. The research I'm currently doing seeks to understand how this politics of the monetization of land and the real estate turn in urban policy plays out differently in different cities across Asia with very different governance systems and very different land tenure regimes. A central argument that I'm developing in this research is that there are contradictions in this real estate turn in urban policy that have important implications for social and political equity and for the ecological future of cities. To illustrate this argument, I want to start by talking about two cases of urban redevelopment that I think help to illustrate these contradictions. The first is the case of Bung Kak in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. This is a story that begins in 2008 when Shukaku Incorporated, a local corporation, signed a 99-year lease that enabled them to fill and develop a lake in the center of Phnom Penh, Cambodia. Now, as it turned out, Shukaku was owned by Lau Meng Kin, and so you can, what you see here is the lake in its current state. Shukaku is owned by Lau Meng Kin, a senator from the Cambodian People's Party, which is the ruling political party in this one-party authoritarian state. Shukaku's stated intention was to develop a master-planned commercial, office, and residential megaproject on this lake, which by 2011 was completely filled. So the image here shows the lake in its current state. These cannons that you see are the cannons that were used to shoot silt into this lake. Silt was piped from an adjoining river to fill this lake, and the land currently stands in the state that you see it remains undeveloped in part because of the controversy related to this project. At the time of the lease signing, the lake had also been home to about 4,000 households who had built their homes at its fringe and on stilts that extended out onto the lake. And so in this image, you can kind of see this kind of finger of marshy land that juts out onto the lake, and that was covered with small households. And in fact, there were households ringing this lake, just built on stilts out onto the lake. 4,000 households, that's about 20,000 people who were living on the lake before it was filled. Many of these households made their living from the lake itself by fishing or farming morning glory, which grew on the surface of the lake. The process of evicting these households met with strong protest. In 2012, 13 women were arrested and sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for their role in protests against this project. Those sentences were eventually overturned, and they were released in part as a result of strong international condemnation of the arrests. The filling of the lake is also controversial because of its potential environmental impacts, and indeed, communities surrounding this lake have experienced significant flooding since the filling of the lake. The second case that I'll talk about is that of the National Capital Integrated Coastal Development Plan in Jakarta, Indonesia. This is more famously known as the Garuda Plan, for reasons that should be apparent. This is a landfill on the ocean along the coast north of Jakarta, and you can see that the landfill is built in the form of a Garuda, this mythical Hindu bird that has very strong symbolic resonance in Indonesia. Now, this project, undertaken as a cooperation between the Indonesian and Dutch governments, involves the reclamation of about 1,250 hectares of land along the north coast of Jakarta. The project is framed as a response to the threat of flooding of Jakarta, and in fact, estimates have that by 2050, something like 80% of the land area of Jakarta is threatened with inundation as a result of sea level rise and land subsidence from groundwater extractions. The project forms a massive barrier against storm surge along Jakarta's north shore. This expensive infrastructural undertaking is to be financed in large part through the commercial development of the reclaimed land, which is conceived as an integrated urban development, including a central business district there in the body of the Garuda and some residents for some 1.5 million eventual residents. And so you often see this in these mega projects, that there are these projections for these very high eventual population figures for the developed land. These projects rarely ever meet those kinds of very high projections, but that's the number that they're putting out there is 1.5 million eventual residents. These two projects are not at all unique. The financing of infrastructure through the active intervention of governments in the acquisition and transfer of land for real estate development has been central to the model of economic growth in, for example, China and Singapore. This is an image from a project in Chongqing, China. And in China, the use of government-owned land as a mechanism to finance the development of infrastructure in large-scale urban development has been key to their model of rapid urbanization, rapid infrastructure development, and rapid economic growth. Many other governments, for example, in the Philippines and India, have sought to engage in large-scale land sales for similar purposes. These two projects help to show the ways that the real estate turn in urban policy is represented as a means to solve pressing urban problems. So in the Bangkok case, the development of a globally competitive downtown for Phnom Penh. In the Garuda case, both an economic development initiative, but also a flood mitigation goal. In each case, governments generate monetary value from the creation of new land, reclaimed land, as a means to finance infrastructure and to create globally competitive urban spaces. In both cases, these new lands are conceived as a canvas for the application of the ingenuity of corporate developers. Yet, as I've noted, these two cases also reveal the contradictions of this model. First, there's what I'll call the contradiction of ecological marginalization. Phnom Penh and Jakarta, like many other Asian cities, are along coastal lands or in river deltas. With sea level rise, land subsidence, and the sprawling of urban development and watersheds, flooding has emerged as a perennial and devastating crisis in many Asian cities. The relationship between land and water is therefore a very significant issue. Yet, when the calculation of profitability of large corporate developers becomes a central foundation of urban development policy, this introduces, I would argue, a profound irrationality that confuses the political calculations involved in coping with this ecological crisis. This is illustrated most clearly in the case of Bangkok, where this state pursuit of land wealth occurs in a one-party state that is lured to exploit urban megaprojects as one way to fuel its patronage machine. The result is a relatively straightforward case of a taking of land in the interest of a small economic elite, or what the geographer David Harvey has referred to as accumulation by dispossession. The logic of profit maximization, which drives the filling of water bodies, exacerbates this flooding problem that's endemic to the city. And the Bangkok case is but one of a number of projects being developed that are being built on water bodies. Here are three other projects, very large-scale residential and commercial developments that are being built along or on waterways in marshy areas, along rivers, or on lakes. The Bangkok and similar projects reallocate vulnerability downwards on the socioeconomic scale, as the elite who are intended to live in these enclaves stay dry. As the elite who live in these enclaves stay dry, while surrounding communities must cope with the ecological consequences of interest group-driven development. The Jakarta case is somewhat more complicated. Here, land monetization is posed as a solution to flooding. Yet a closer examination reveals that the push to monetize land in the interest of economic development and corporate profitability has in fact contributed to the flooding problem in the first place. So one thing that I'm particularly interested in currently is the permitting of land, that developers in Jakarta are sitting on permits, development permits to tens of thousands of hectares of land throughout Jakarta. And these development permits are a legacy of the Suharto era in the late 1980s and into the 1990s. And one particular example is that there was one project called Bukit Jungle Asri, for which 30,000 hectares of land were permitted for a large-scale new town development. And this project went to a consortium of developers that was in fact headed by President Suharto's son. And this was land that was, so 30,000 hectares is about twice the land area of Boston. And this was land that was in a protected area as part of the larger Jakarta watershed. And in fact, last year, the head of the corporate, so these permits continue to be held by these developers. And in fact, last year, the head of the corporation that holds those Bukit Jungle Asri permits was arrested on charges of bribing the regent of Bogor to issue land conversion permits for protected forest areas. So this is an ongoing issue. The Garuda project focuses attention outwards on the ocean and the threat of storm surge as the core of the threat of flooding. In doing so, however, what I'm arguing is that it turns its back on the very real causes of flooding that are rooted in land development policies that have encouraged out-of-control speculative development. The second contradiction that I'll talk about, and the first contradiction was the contradiction of ecological marginalization. The second one is the contradiction of exclusion. In pursuing the logic of profit maximization, these developments attempt to draw a red line around these spaces of wealth and consumption. They attempt to separate them from surrounding communities of what most cities constitute a significant urban majority, lower-income people whose economic foothold in the city is often tenuous. These are communities that are often deemed illegal by governments, made up mostly of low and moderate income people whose livelihoods are dependent on the larger urban economy. The hardening of the boundaries between the wealthy and the rest exacerbates spatial segregation. It also tends to sever the linkages between small enterprises of lower income people and the opportunity created by the wealth concentrated within these enclaves. And I think this is illustrated by the eviction of the farmers in Bangkok and their exclusion from this new development that's coming up. Policy approaches to the threat of flooding have, unfortunately, often further exacerbated this exclusion. As the Garuda Project illustrates, the agenda of flood control has come to be tied to an aesthetic agenda of urban beautification that is in part premised on the concealment of low-income communities. The clearance of communities living along rivers and canals has in particular been promoted as a means both to reduce flooding and to stimulate economic growth and property development through the creation of new amenity spaces. And in fact, the beautification of rivers and the clearance of informal communities along rivers in, for example, Manila and Jakarta have led to the displacement of tens of thousands of people. In elaborating the contradictions of these two projects in Jakarta and Phnom Penh, I've tried to show how this agenda of land monetization and this new kind of focus on land as a monetary asset, as a financial asset, has come to be a driving force shaping urban politics in contemporary Asian cities. The intent is not to argue that these mega projects, such as the images that I've shown, are in fact the future of Asian cities, and it's notable in fact that neither of the two projects I've mentioned have actually been built, and both seem to be stalled. Rather, the intent is to illustrate how rising land values have led governments to tether their policy agendas to the maximization of land values and corporate real estate profits, and to argue that this agenda has in fact exacerbated existing social and ecological contradictions. Problems of urban poverty and growing urban ecological hazards are often intimately related to unequal access to social resources and to political power. The push of governments to monetize lands has, in many instances, deepened this inequality. I'll conclude by discussing a very different case of a different kind of urban intervention, one that arises from one community's efforts to confront its own vulnerability. This is a case of the efforts of a community organization by the name of Buklo Tao, working in a community called Banaba in Metro Manila, the Philippines. Now, Barangay Banaba barangay means neighborhood, is a neighborhood, whoops, I went up instead of down, is a neighborhood that exists mostly within this horseshoe of land created around this, surrounded by this river. And this is right at the border between Metro Manila and the adjoining province of Bulacan in a town called San Jose del Monte. And so this is a low moderate income community of squatters or illegal dwellers. This is a community that has faced a lot of flooding in recent years. At the peak of the floodwaters, this is an image from within the community to give a sense of the scale of flooding that occurs. If you see that structure in the background there, the tallest structure in the image, at the peak of the flooding a couple of years ago during Typhoon Katsana, the waters actually reached to the roof of that building. And this community has worked very hard through a community organization to try to build its own resilience. They have, for example, developed a community-based map using a base map of their area, and using push pins through a participatory process. They have worked to try to identify the areas that are most prone to floods, but also where the people are most vulnerable, so the community organization can target its efforts to build resilience within those areas of the community. They've developed economic development and food security initiatives, such as building a community garden. They have developed a boat building enterprise, which is intended both to give them boats so they can escape the waters when they come next, but also they're selling these boats to surrounding communities as an income-generating initiative. And they have also worked with the local provincial government to try to deal with some of the root causes of the flooding as they see them. So this image shows, you see here, this here is Banaba, and this shows the larger region of which it's a part. And what you can see in the image on the upper right-hand portion is significant development that's taking place in upland areas around this part of Metro Manila, the larger Metro Manila. So what they're saying is that the out-of-control land conversion and development taking place upland from them is in fact what's driving the flooding that they're experiencing, and they're trying to work, and often this development is of questionable legality, and so they're trying to really work with the provincial government to stop this out-of-control upland development. I conclude with this case of Buklod because I think it helps to illustrate an alternative model of politics. This alternative politics involves recognizing the roots of community vulnerability in lack of access to land. It involves working with the energy and initiative of communities to seek solutions in collaboration with them. In some, it involves the creation of a more inclusive political process. I'll conclude my presentation with the question, can a model of urban development premised centrally on land monetization be reconciled with this more inclusive political process? And the answer, in my view, is no, at least not entirely. The tensions outlined in this talk, between social equity and community resilience on one hand and a policy agenda focused on land-based revenue and profit maximization on the other, will continue to be a focus of urban political struggles in the immediate future of Asian cities. And so to kind of make a connection to the previous panel, I'm not necessarily arguing that we need to work only through community-based initiative to find solutions, for example, to the problems of flooding in places like Banaba. We also do need large-scale infrastructural initiatives that address the larger watershed issues and issues of global warming. But I think, to me, what really came out of the last panel was, as Bish said, the question of scale. And how do we train planners working at various scales to bridge those connections so that they can understand what the impact of what they're doing at an urban or regional scale might have on people at the street level or at the community level? And how similarly do we build on the capacity of communities like Banaba and Buklod to understand their own place within a larger urban system and build connections upward so that they can scale up their own initiatives? And I think that really requires a change in mindset, both from the community level and at the city and regional scale. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Abidin Kusno, who will speak on Turning Time, Collective Desires, and the Ghost of the Past, some notes from Jakarta.
First of all, of course, thank you to Enrique and also to Cynthia for inviting me here to share with you some of my thoughts on the issues of the politics of the city. I think the title itself, The Future is Now, is in fact a fascinating slogan, you might put it that way, because that really reminds me of the first president of Indonesia, Suharto, back in 1960s. He actually had that in mind as well. The future is now. But the way he thinks about the future is to actually bring that future in the form of modernist architecture and urban design onto the place of Jakarta, with the assumption that by changing urban space, you can actually create a whole new generation. So the future is now, for him, is really you bring that future into our own space right now. But I guess the spirit of this talk today, The Future is Now, is really to try to understand the now itself can actually contribute to the future. So there's a lot to learn about the now. That, I think, is the spirit behind this getting together. And as I somehow try to formulate my own talk, I just realized that this now, for the case of Jakarta, Indonesia, is really in some way and reflect on what we call the past as well. So I begin to feel a little bit somehow confused by how to organize, this periodization, the future, the present, and also the past. And as what I'm going to share with you, the past continues to come back to the present. So that's why that whole notions of the ghost of the past continues to haunt us in the present. And when I start to formulate this talk, and I look for some of the articles that have been written about the notion of the politics of the city of Jakarta, and I actually encountered an article written back in 1996 by two anthropologists in the Netherlands, from Leiden actually, Manasseh Malo and Peter Ness. They both have this piece really about urban politics in Jakarta. And what is interesting about the article is that they are able to consolidate the sort of key groups that actually transform Jakarta. And what they saw is that the most important groups operating in Jakarta, urban areas, are central and local government. And there's also the military group. And there's also the business community. And then they also put down the common people. These are some of the groups that actually came up from their research. And I'm going to just build up some of my points based on their finding, because this was written in 1996, just 2 years before the collapse of the Suharto authoritarian regime, and how some of their points continue to be relevant, but still we have to put the new components into it. And in some way, one could talk about the whole politics of Jakarta. In fact, by just following their sort of a diagram over here, you could really get a good deal of the politics of the city. But this was written again before what we call decentralization, before the post-authoritarian Jakarta's era. And so therefore, what you do not see from their diagrams is that they do not see the differentiation between the central and the local government, central and the city government. Which today, the city government, in fact, play a major role in city politics. And they also do not see the common people as having any sort of agency. And therefore, you get a kind of a feeling that, and I'm just trying to tease out, an image that somehow portrayed these notions of the common people, which in Indonesian term is called rakyat, right? And the way Malo and Nas frame it is that they are migrants who settle on empty space, and they are not organized, and they do not promote common plans. So you can see this aspect of being very organic in terms of when you use the notion of organic in the morning session, right? How people somehow feel a kind of a liberty to use all kinds of spaces for all kinds of a livelihood. And then at the same time, you would see certain forces of discipline comes in. And they would get, in some way, the pedestrian get organized again, but then later on, they would return back to this space again. And that has been the kind of a characterizations of what we call the rakyat, the common people who are really seems to have their own autonomy, and they do not want to be managed and do not want to be organized. And in some way, that has a lot to do with their way of survival as well. And I guess we have to probably reframe the whole notion of politics here in order to understand the politics of the urban poor. I think this is one issue that I think we should discuss further. And the other thing that Malo and Nas didn't discuss is the notion of the middle class, which is another missing component, which I have a feeling that back in the Suharto time, the middle class is considered as a sort of a group that is basically working, or in fact they were nurtured by both the government as well as the military. In some way, it is not a sort of a group that has the kind of a progressive agenda. But again, in the post-Suharto era, this group become quite important. And what is also missing in their diagram is what we call the subcontracting power. Now, I will actually make a bit of a further discussion on this. Now, subcontracting power is the whole idea that all this diagram, maybe I should probably just move to a diagram over here. This is a sketches that I have come up with just to get a sense of the urban politics of Jakarta today. You have the governments, divided into central and local government, and then the military, which is now in some way is in decline in the post-Suharto era. And you have this big business group. Gavin, I think, has addressed these issues. And then the middle class is sort of a component that is missing in NAS discussion, but I think it is beginning to emerge as a powerful force in the city today. And then there's this common people, right, the rakyat, the urban poor. Now, between all of this diagram, there are all kind of components, the elements that connect all these different diagrams together, all these bubbles together. And this is what one would call the kind of a subcontracting power. So the central government or the city government, they are really not operating to the ground level. They in fact subcontract a lot of their powers. And so when you reach the very local level, you realize that this local level seems to have its own autonomy. And therefore, the common people, they are in some way related to this multitude, these other components, and the military group as well, and the middle class group as well. And this is the kind of a notion that we often use, which is the freeman, the praeman, which is the sort of a social group that seems to be able to move around different components. And they are a sort of dealers as well. They are the one who actually have a kind of a local authority, and they are the one who make connection between the higher power and the sort of rakyat, the urban poor as well. I guess in order to clarify this point, I just want to make one example. If you go to Jakarta, you came out of the airport, there will always someone who would lead you to the taxi station, even though you know where the taxi is located. And if you have a car, you go to your car and they would lead you to the exit, even though you know where the exit is. Now, this is what we call the kind of a subcontracting power that the government, in fact, allow this group to operate. And this is how people get employed. Now, some people would define these social actors as belonging to what we call the informal sector, but they're actually quite formal in that sense because they are allowed, they are permitted. So there's a lot of these elements that move between what we call the formal element, the middleman, which I think is the important component when we talk about the right to the city. And of course, these middlemen, they consist of components of the urban poor. They also can consist of elements from the military. They can consist of elements from the middle class. So they can be anybody, and therefore they can be nobody as well. Now, one of the major things that when people in Jakarta talk about the urban poor, they know that the urban poor can be very easily appropriated, can very easily be used by political parties and by what they call the freemen, and therefore they can be an instrument for power agenda. And I'm just now going to look at this image, move very quickly. The notions of the praeman, and this is actually from a newspaper, Kompas, who has this big title called "Don't Let Praeman Politics Destroy the Indonesian State." Now, the notion of praeman is in fact this whole, subcontracting power groups who are able to, in some way, penetrate political parties and even take over what we call the House of the Parliament. Yeah, so that whole image about how political parties can also become a freeman, I think it's a sort of conditions that the city is encountering. And as you can see from this banner, the parliament is seen as committed to obstructing some of the reform forces and try to return Indonesian politics to the Suharto era. So therefore, the title here is that, we just want to basically, if you need this parliament, we can sell it to you, but don't go through the middleman. Yeah, and that is a sort of a protest voices from below. And so if you again go back to this diagram over here, in 5 minutes, I will just basically wrap up. what the current government, the city government, is trying to do is to affiliate itself with the common people, with the rakyat. And in some way, they are trying to dismantle this whole middleman connection. So there's a lot of attempt to reach out to the rakyat without going through what we call the free man. And of course, there are many agendas that are basically pro-poor agendas. And I think the current city government has been doing quite well in providing, the social system that would allow the poor to be able to live in the city, such as the provisions of the free healthcare and also free education. And they are also somehow trying to accommodate what is called the irregular settlements, not so much allowing them to stay in the existing place, but they're actually trying to relocate them and to move them to a different area in a way that is still close to their livelihood. And they are also somehow trying to manage vendors by facilitating their existence. And they in fact repair vendors' cards and offer new cards while giving them permit to operate with no cost. And so there are many different attempts over here, and one of the most significant one is also to reform the whole bureaucracy of the city government, because the city government has in the past been associated with what we call, the place for Preman to penetrate as well. So there's an attempt to clean the whole city government as well. Now, these are the kind of a major, what we might call, quote unquote, the reformist forces that actually try to move the city hall into a sort of a more progressive direction, right? But if people who follow the current development in Jakarta or in Indonesia today, we know there's a counter force coming up that basically try to, return the whole politics back into the Suharto era by removing the direct elections for the local leaders. And in fact, this election is the one that actually allow the current city administration to come into being. So I guess I should probably just stop here and we can discuss further, but just to give you a little map of what we call the politics of the city today. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Mona Serageldin, who is the Vice President of the Institute for International Urban Development, and her talk is titled Collaborating for Access, Equality, and Inclusion.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting conference. And in addressing and following on the previous speakers in our challenging panels on the politics of the city, I will go back and follow on all the reasons mentioned by the first panel, the conspicuous evidence of economic and social disparities make cities, particularly the larger and denser ones, a fertile ground for challenges to the established order when that order is viewed as unjust, oppressive, or corrupt. Youth always seek the excitement of change, and older people prefer or want the security of stability. They can and do clash, but university cities remain the centers of protest where concentrations of intellectuals and young people readily mobilize to demand redress and reforms. I will focus my remark on the quest for social inclusion in the booming Asian cities. City politics primarily focus on local issues and seek negotiations rather than confrontations. The city is an ideal forum for pressing demands for social inclusion through access to jobs, living wages, and decent living conditions, as well as more subtle rights, including spaces for freedom and opportunity, as mentioned by Professor Amartya Sen. Without economic opportunity and social inclusion, cities experience disruptive vulnerability and turmoil. I'm convinced that inability to deal effectively with access to urban land and with accountability in local governance constitute the major impediments to inclusion in the cities. The high value of urban land relegates poor families to settle in hazardous areas and squeezes limited income families out of the formal markets for housing, leading to the formation of slums and informal settlements. High rates of appreciation of land values also contribute to perpetuate corruption, particularly among officials and practitioners involved in land-related issues. Complaints about arbitrariness and illegal exactions by officers at registries, surveyors, notaries, municipal officials who issue subdivision and construction permits, building inspectors and tax collectors are the rule rather than the exception. Complicated and cumbersome legal and administrative procedures related to land rights and transactions are further impediments to equitable access. Most cities in developing countries, and not just Asian cities, exhibit sharp contrast between slums and informal neighborhoods and older deteriorated areas on one hand, and new planned developments and gentrified urban enclaves and gated communities on the other. Their proliferation underscores the extent of marginalization and exclusionary practices in each of the cities. Except for capital cities and gateways, where national government plays a major role in shaping urban development, mostly through large-scale projects, as has been mentioned, action at the city level emerges from the variety of actors mentioned in the first panel, and intervention by governors, mayors, businesses, landowners and developers, and local NGOs and community leaders. However, relationship among these groups often suffer from lack of trust and can be quite strained. Even when they share similar objectives, they work sometimes at cross-purpose and often fail to support each other's action. Land dispossession or denial of use are major catalysts of protests and confrontations which can turn very violent. Short of mustering sufficient political support to entice positive responses, visibility through the media, and government vulnerability to pressure by foreign powers sympathetic to the cause are necessary ingredients, but by no means guarantees that grievances and hardships will be addressed. Emerging from an anti-urban ethos, China plans its city's development strategy to support its export-driven economic growth. The focus on the coastal cities led to the disparities that China is now trying to address through the development corridors to the interiors and other issues mentioned by the previous previous speakers. But to overcome legal constraints on their power, Chinese cities, in their quest for modernity and competitiveness, rely on special purpose vehicles, which are wholly owned companies that combine freedom to operate on a commercial basis with the backing of municipal legal authorities. Financed by the domestic markets, SVPs have secured land reserves for their projects, displacing farmers through a mix of forced evictions and promises of future urban jobs. When jobs fail to materialize, the dispossessed families protest and are most often repressed. They end up joining the hundreds of millions of migrants providing cheap labor for China's booming dynamic cities. the greater the contrast between land under its current use and its development potential, the more the predicament of the dispossessed tends to be ignored. Inhabitants of older districts slated for demolition are relocated to peri-urban location, removed from their jobs, which makes them totally dependent on labor contractors for employment and survival. Shanghai's Urban Development Investment Corporation has resettled millions of people to create Asia's leading financial center, including over 3 million people to build Pudong on this empty island here that you see, to build Pudong and redevelop older neighborhoods. A notable exception where protests by families facing forced evictions have led to negotiated agreement occurred in Beijing, probably due to its world visibility. Now, fear of reprisals and need to survive lead to coexistence between local authorities, developers of informal settlements, and inhabitants of marginal sites. Discrimination and exploitation of the vulnerabilities of poor and landless families is most visible in Dhaka, a city where intertwined political and business interests have prevented updating the valuation of real estate for over 50 years, while land values have doubled on the average every 3 years. Squatters settle on lowlands that flood regularly. The strongmen, Mastans, who control the sites, have close links with municipal and utility agencies. A Kacha shack rents on a similar per square meter price as a middle-class apartment. Mastans provide access to water at 10 times the price and electricity as 5 times the price paid by residents in these apartments. The majority of the very poor are single woman garment workers and female-headed households. Despite high land values, slum landlordism is a very lucrative investment. There are no laws limiting forced evictions, which can be violent, with houses burned and women raped. Displaced families squat on the pavement until they can save enough to join a Mastine organized invasions. Since they have no legal address, no ID, people without some form of legal tenure are unable to leverage their votes. Amid this general indifference to their plight, Mrs. Sultana Kamal, founder of a human rights NGO, has taken up this issue of forced eviction, both on legal grounds and on humanitarian grounds. It is an admirable activism in the face of legal constraints and bureaucratic hurdles. Now, going further east, the Jakarta, which was just mentioned, Kampung Improvement Program, first conceived in the middle 60s as a citywide public health initiative, is one of the earliest and most successful examples of cooperation between city authorities and communities. And it has inspired many of the other initiatives that have come after that, because it evolved into a partnership where community leaders had a major role in making decisions. Having been overshadowed by the real estate boom of the 90s, mentioned by the previous speaker, it came once more to the forefront after the crash at the end of the decade as kampungs started to reappear in the city. Local governments, in general, are reluctant to partner in rights-based initiatives that NGOs and CBOs favor, because it commits them to support an issue rather than a project. And furthermore, since banks refuse to provide credit to community-based organizations, Success of cooperative initiatives is therefore contingent on the involvement and support provided by NGOs and national specialized agencies whose mission and mandate is to support community development. Among notable approaches that have achieved success is Ahmedabad's slum upgrading program. The collaboration of the municipal corporation with SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association of India, allowed SEWA Mahila Trust to it's a microfinance arm, housing arm, to organize slum communities by creating women-headed association and guide their negotiation with local authorities. Residents were given security of occupancy for 10 years that could be extended, and used access to microfinance to change, transform their houses, demolish their shacks, and create houses. This program did improve, demolish the shacks and create houses. This program did improve health, income, and school attendance. It gives residents, particularly women, a feeling of dignity. Not surprisingly, the municipality excluded the slums stretching along the river from the program, since the waterfront was slated for redevelopment into high-end commercial and tourism projects. Further east, Thailand's Urban Development Community Development Office, ATCO, it was established in 1992 as a poverty reduction agency, was a leader in operationalizing community-led development and using land readjustment, which is also called reblocking, to enable the poor to live in the location they occupied and participate in shaping the improvements that affect them. To work throughout the nation, it decentralized activities by creating savings groups in target communities and networking them to foster cooperation on common problems. The system strengths derived from the fact that ATCO channeled funds to through the networks to lend to the members' community development organization. In 2000, ATCO was merged with its rural counterpart to create the Community Organization Development Institute, CODI. CODI reinforced the approach by linking the CBOs it had created with local authorities to undertake city-wide cross-sectoral programs. To avoid displacement in reblocking projects, it ensures that land is held in collective ownership or long-term leaseholds for a minimum of 15 years. Reflecting on these examples and other experiences, it is clear that the success of urban resilience initiatives hinges on the degree to which city authorities understand that partnerships and collaborative action require participation, empowerment, and accountability. CBOs also have to understand that they must remain inclusive and fend off attempts at co-option by one group in the community, even when it is the dominant political party. On their part, national agencies must develop an institutional capacity to implement community-led development programs. Today, CODI is a model for similar agencies, but it took CODI over 10 years to build up this capacity. Despite the emergence of an active citizenship in urban society and its growing social consciousness, reaching an agreement on an urban policy agenda promoting inclusiveness and fighting exclusion has proved a difficult task. Undoubtedly, Brazil's Right to the City has captured the imagination of activists everywhere and spawned numerous social movements. However, implementation is impeded by the complexities involved in opening up access to urban land, and also by the attractiveness of the profits that its rapid appreciation can provide to those who know how to use it. With increasing densities in the cities, the limits of tolerance of disparities and exclusionary practices is reached as soon as incomes stagnate and purchasing power is eroded by inflation. Whether protests manage to significantly influence local government depends on activist political skills, the degree of disruption protests cause to people's livelihoods and daily activities, and also on the strengths and connections of affected real estate interests. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We can now open up the floor to questions. In order to try to get as many comments in as possible, maybe we'll collect a couple or a few at a time. Does anyone want to start us off? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I think this has been really a very illuminating session. The speakers have spoken very eloquently about the politics of land in contemporary cities, and also the last presentation by Mona regarding China, and by Abidin about Jakarta. You know, I look at China, first of all, because that's where I spent over 7 years at head of the United Nations. Land grabbing, you know, has become a culture in the provinces. Since the devolution and decentralization, the provinces are supposed to mobilize resources for their own development activities. So the land is taken away from the poor farmers, and there is a nexus, very close cooperation between the commercial predators and the local authorities to deprive people of the land and push them out of there. And then, you know, the price of the land is exorbitant. So much money is made by the local authorities in collaboration with the commercial developers. So this, I think, leads to, again, we talk of exclusion. You know, the people who are driven out of these spaces, they live on the fringes of the cities, and they are no access to the socio-economic facilities. And in China, I think this is very, very much a phenomenon, I think, which needs to be, I think now the new government is addressing it in a severe way, looking at how to control the corruption in that context as well. And of course, the problem in Jakarta, I believe, is different. And similarly, in Bangladesh, it's different. It's the migrants who come into the city looking for a better life, looking for the gold and improvement in the quality of their lives. So they live on, again, you know, they are excluded, in fact, from, they don't have access to clean drinking water, they don't have access to good schools, they don't have the resources to improve their lives. So I think this is quite a challenge, you know, which the developing countries are facing. What is most important, as Adil also mentioned this morning, the management of the cities, how to improve the governance, how to empower the people to participate in running their cities and addressing their problems. Thank you very much.
Would you like to respond now? Gavin, Mona, or Abidin, which, any of you want to respond to this point?
Yeah, I could.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Well, the question is really about issues of land grabbing, which is in fact is Gavin's subject matter as well when it comes to the idea of commercializations of land and urban space. And then the second issue is about migration to the city. People from the rural areas continue to migrate to the city, and they are not being given a sort of a facilities or being accommodated by the city itself. Now, my immediate response to that is that what is strange and also interesting about Jakarta is that it continues to attract people. It continues to allow people to survive in a very strange way. It is a place where, in some way, we cannot say that the government completely ignore those migrants. We could probably more appropriate to say that the government allow migrants to self-organize themselves. When it comes to the issues of land, there is what is known as the category called the informal land market that coexists with what is then known as the formal land market. And this informal land market is a sort of a domain where migrants would come in and they would be able to find a sort of a place either by renting it and because the place is located in what is called the informal land market, therefore the price is rather low. So that informal land market has been preserved for a long time. And it's only until recently when World Bank has come up with this idea of formalization of informal land, then this type of land become more and more limited.
Yes.
So I think that is actually the current issues over here. And even that, one can still continue to see how people, change their houses, change their unit, and turn one single unit into 10 units, and rent those things out. This is a sort of what we call almost like a self-organizations below the state, which continue to make a place like Jakarta a place for migrants. So I guess I'm just try to tease out that there's another level in the city that seems to operate that allow migrants to continue to come in without really being managed. And I'm not saying that that is a really good way to handle the city, but in some way it allows people to find hope and to continue to survive in the urban center.
Yes, this land market, this informal land market is indeed very important in some cities, including my own, which is Cairo, Egypt. It is the most important market as far as area covered in the city. But it is also has its own developers. It's not the person does not simply come and pitch a tent or somewhere. There is a whole organization. Right. It's a market. There is a whole organization about how to come in, who to pay, where, and then you're shown where to settle. And, there is a whole system to it. And the Mastans in Bangladesh are just part of that system. That's also are the quotas in the kampung.
Yeah.
So are the quotas in the kampung. These are just the way that market operates. It has small-scale developers, small-scale builders, and they subdivide, and they rent and sell and develop, and it is a very important market, and we cannot ignore it.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the question that this whole discussion raises for me, and part of what I struggle with in the project that I'm doing on land acquisition and government land acquisition, is the question of what are the terms of the rights of access to urban land in Asian cities. That seems to be the real struggle, that we're discussing and describing these quote-unquote informal land markets, which play such a critical role. But how do those end up being defined as informal? And there's often a long history here. And so I've been reading about Jakarta, which is a city that I'm actually fairly new to the study of. But what's remarkable to me is the way in which there's this distinction between registered and unregistered land. And the unregistered land market is a kind of a subordinate land market. It's a weaker form of claim to land. And yet if you look at the history of that, that's rooted in colonial rule and the Dutch imposition of essentially a dualism between, and Abidin can speak to this more intelligently than I can, but a distinction between the lands of formal claims to land that are primarily exclusively for Europeans and wealthy Indonesians, and then this much larger subordinate set of land claims. And so when we think about the fairness of all of this and what it means for social equity more generally in a society, I think we really need to raise that question. Do we need to fundamentally rethink that question of what are the terms under which people have access to and claims to land? It seems to be a critical question.
Thank you. Another question. Eugenio, please.
Professor Shatkin, you spoke about the irrationality of real estate profitability and the fact that it actually drives the city in a bad direction. And you do not believe that that should be what drives the city. In all the papers, there was discussion at the same time of the importance of governance and of the central government as well as of the local government, but also of NGOs. Where do you stand on this relationship between government and NGOs? Are NGOs really the solution? Is the central government the solution? Is the provincial government the solution? In China, for example, the central government is seen by local people very often as better than the provincial government, less corrupt. It can come in and intervene. Whether that's true or not, it's another matter. But I'm a little bit, grasping for what could be, in your view, all of you, the solution. Is the NGOs? Is it the collaborations?
So, very good question. And so I was critical of developers and the role of the real estate industry in the way that cities are being shaped. But that's not necessarily a criticism of developers themselves. I think developers do their job. Their job is to try to make money from land development. What I'm questioning really, this panel is about politics, is the politics of all of that, and really the kind of nexus between government and the real estate industry, which is what I think really introduces that irrationality. And so I guess the question I would raise is, essentially what you see in a case like that of Jakarta and the case of Phnom Penh is a subversion of markets and land in ways that really slant the profitability of the land development system in the interests of, again, a small elite. And so it's that, again, that nexus that I'm really questioning. So I guess, with respect to the question of whether NGOs are the solution, I think, I believe very strongly in NGOs. I think they play a critical role. I disagree that NGOs cannot act at a scale. I think if you look, for example, at the case of Barangay Banaba, that is a very large-scale intervention undertaken by a community organization. In fact, we talk about self-organization. That really is thousands of organizations that function collaboratively to solve problems on behalf of communities. But my thing about NGOs is that they actually need to work very closely with government, that to function at a larger scale, they need to have assistance from government in, first of all, protecting their claims to space. They need to be able to collaborate across larger scales of action, which often requires the assistance of government. So I guess the question that I'll kind of pose is, we often talk about public-private partnerships, but why don't we talk more about public-community partnerships as a balancing power to try to counterbalance some of the influence of larger corporate and real estate forces in urban governance. So I hope that's a broad answer, but I hope that starts to answer the question.
Well, I think you said quite rightly, collaboration between government and communities. And I believe very much in that, hence the examples that I chose to discuss. But I think that sometimes you need an NGO in that cooperation.
Yes.
Sometimes there is just so much distrust that you can't bridge it. You need an NGO that has the trust of the community to be able to come and play the role of the facilitator like Sewa did in Ahmedabad. I think that's a very important role for NGOs. The NGOs that Coady created are more along the issue that you mentioned of being able to go to scale. So, you create one in each city and then you network them, and then your power of keeping the project or the development program on track is through the channeling of funds through that network. And that also has proved to be a very, very successful model. So I think it's more cooperation, and how we can structure the cooperation will be different in the different countries and cities, depending on on the laws that control land rights, land tenure, formal and informal, because unregistered rights are still recognized. And we cannot possibly ignore them because they are unregistered. The courts don't.
So just I'm sorry, to build a little bit on what
Sure,
you're saying, I mean, a real question for me is, how do you bridge what seems to be this kind of social gap between the world of government and the world of communities and non-governmental organizations? That seems to me to be a real obstacle. And maybe part of the answer, not to offend engineers in the room, but this is not what engineering training is about, but in a lot of places, a lot of urban development planning gets done by engineers. And so the ability to understand social systems at the grassroots level and to intervene in them is often something that's not in the training of engineers, that's sometimes not in the training of planners. And so how do we need to think about education of planners and policymakers to begin to build that bridge?
Yes, on the notion of governance, I mean, I think the whole set of problems with Jakarta is that the government is not so much about governing, but actually, subcontracting governance, really. It is about dividing jobs and to just bring up these issues of private developers. Private developers came into being, the real estate Indonesia, that was in 1972 actually. And that came at the same time when the government decided that the real estate developers should just be handling the upper middle class housing demands, and where else the state government should really take care of the low-cost housing. So with that kind of a job division, the developers, when they do things, it is really this idea of private sectors, this idea of the upper middle class will be able to buy houses, and therefore their whole enterprise is to just build that type of houses with the idea that the government will be able to handle the low-cost housing. So that is how the city got divided into what we call the have and the have-not area. And the city government has always been connected to the central government. And I think the first panel, Bisanial actually mentioned this point about the fact that what is distinctive about Asian cities is that the capital city especially is always connected to the nation. And therefore it has never had its own agency. And the city government in Jakarta today, they are beginning to gain some power, but that is so recent that we still do not know where they are actually standing. They actually try to concentrate more power for themselves by negotiating with the national government. Why don't you just give us some of your land? So the land itself is divided into national lands and also city lands, and that really makes things very chaotic. And so at this point, the whole value, the whole idea of whether the city, right, should accommodate the poor is still being debated, whether the poor should be located at the peri-urban or it should be at the center of the city. And of course, the NGOs, the whole idea is to really allow people to understand that the city has to be heterogeneous. It has to allow the poor to be located in the city. So we are actually at the center of this whole debate on, you have all this job division, but at the same time, how are you going to talk to each other and to start to realize the kind of a city, the kind of city we want, and by what means are we going to get there? Yeah.
One more question we have time for? Yes.
Thank you for such wonderful presentations. It's so great to see what happens when such three great minds get together and talk about their different projects under one broad topic. I'm stuck and fascinated by Abidin's concept of subcontracting power. And I want to do something that might seem a little unfair, but I'm really curious to see how Gavin and Mona, you react or pick up on that concept that Abidin introduced, subcontracting power, in your own work. In many ways, it reminds me of flexible citizenship, flexible labor, and so forth. But I got a sense that there's something beyond that, and I was left wondering, what do we have the analytical tools or the political strategic tools to deal with this concept? Let's assume it's a concept, and instead of asking Abidin to expand a bit more, I'm curious to see how both of you reacted to his presentation and whether you see that concept in your own work.
Should I start first and then
Yeah, sure.
respond maybe with Mona? Well, that notion of subcontracting power is not really coming from me. It was something I picked up from my friend Abdul Malik Simon, through his work on Jakarta. And the whole idea over here is that the city just simply cannot be governed. Even when the state is so-called powerful under authoritarian regime of Suharto, there's a feeling that the city is just too big, or the city is bigger than the nation, we put it that way. And therefore, there's no way for you to govern the city. And the only way for the city to become a city is to let the city govern itself. And it is where the subcontracting things come in. And people have a sort of a clear idea what that means, partly because if they know that if I go to Jakarta, there are a lot of opportunities. There are a lot of spaces to improvise. There's a lot of things to do, and you can occupy many different positions. And the subcontracting position is a very flexible position. Anyone can be that. The middle class can find him or herself to be in that position. The retired military person can do that as well. And even the urban poor can do that as well. So that is that level that is actually inside as well as outside structure of governance that allow the city to operate in a very strange way. And that is a sort of also what they call the very annoying layer, because it is a sort of a layer where all kind of a deal making is taking place as well. If the military wants to deal with a business group, they have to go through this subcontracting power. The same case, if the middle class, want to be able to live comfortably in the neighborhood, they would have to deal with this security personnel who actually make all kind of a deal with the local community. So they are the one that seems to be their meanings. Like this is a very abstract term. Sometimes we do not know who they are, but we know that anyone can occupy that position, and they are the deal makers that connect different institutions, and that allow, in a very strange way, allow the city to operate sometimes with very little cost. And of course, you could frame it in a very negative term as well, because that is where corruption comes in and so on. But that is how the city survive, and it accommodates the poor as well. If you look at the vendors on the pedestrian, on the sidewalk, you know that they are very spontaneous, they are very organic, but at the same time, they are very well organized as well. They are organized by the subcontracted powers, this group, they are not really working together. Sometimes they are competing with each other as well. So it is very full of uncertainties, but at the same time, there's a feeling that you can actually go to the city and you will just be able to find yourself. So that is that kind of a strange situation that is not easy to grapple with, but that is how the city life begins to take shape.
Mona or Gavin?
Go ahead. Okay, I'll jump in. I mean, the immediate point about the Preman, these intermediaries, struck me as very interesting, in part because I'm interested in land development in Asian cities. And so the land is incredibly valuable. It often has people on it, and they're in the way of sometimes the ambitions of people who want to extract that monetary value that's laying potential there. And so the question of how land gets acquired is a really interesting one to me. And often throughout Asia, you see these intermediary figures emerge as an intermediary between government or real estate actors and the existing users of a space as people who somehow find a way to move them out of the way. And I'm very interested in that process, because that's a process where a lot of bad stuff happens, but perhaps where some positive intervention might occur. It's a very hard thing to research, though, because it's often a shadowy area. But more generally, the idea of subcontracting power resonates very strongly. So one of the things that I've thought about with respect to the kinds of projects that I was showing is the idea of the privatization of urban planning, that urban planning itself, in some cases, increasingly is outsourced to private developers, that rather than governments essentially saying, we don't know how to build a globally competitive and functional city, and therefore let's give a bunch of land to a private developer and let them do it, is one way to look at the way that these projects get developed in some cases. And that's where a lot of exclusion comes in, because real estate developers build for the highest and best users, the highest and best use, meaning the most profitable use. And so I think the idea definitely resonates there. But when we think about subcontracting power, I think you can think about that, you can put a more positive spin on that as well, because at the end of the day, don't we want government to be more inclusive and we're talking about extremely complex systems, don't you want to bring people into that process who can be intermediaries for different types of interests? So the question then becomes, again, how do we ensure power towards what end? And how do we ensure that that the power of those intermediaries is being exercised in a more equitable way, thereby bringing more of those intermediaries into the process from different walks of life?
Well, I think, to answer you, that the importance of the intermediaries, I mean, I don't use personally subcontracting power, okay, but the intermediaries are so important that in every country, in every city, there is a special word to designate them. You go to a place, you know who to ask for.
Yeah.
There is a name for them. And that shows that their importance. If they did not hold this importance, people would not need to find names to define which intermediaries are intermediaries, and I only deal mostly with the ones that deal with issues of land. Mm-hmm. Land, housing, and utilities. But so I think that makes a very important research, but as you say, it is a difficult one to do.
So you get the private developer, you have the city government,
yes,
you have a national government, you have the NGOs, but then you also now have to add another category for
exactly.
the intermediaries. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. We unfortunately have to break for lunch now, but before we do that, please join me in thanking the presenters for giving us so much food for thought.